set it up on two screens this time, so it's inevitably going to cause a whole load of chaos. Yeah, so last week with Jack, we explored the birth of the modern mind through René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, and G.W.F. Hegel, thinkers whose ideas about reason, autonomy, and historical development profoundly shaped the revolutionary political thought that gave rise to the modern republic. Between 1776 and 1804, the Atlantic world witnessed an unprecedented political transformation in which monarchy, long justified through divine right, custom, and hereditary continuity, was challenged by new claims grounded in popular sovereignty, natural rights, and civic participation, producing what may be called the first age of modern republican experimentation. These revolutions were not isolated events, but part of a wider intellectual and geopolitical shift linking Enlightenment philosophy, imperial crisis, fiscal breakdown, and religious contestation, with republicanism emerging as both a theoretical ideal and a practical response to the failures of the ancien regime across both the other side of the Atlantic and this one. The American, French, and Haitian revolutions each articulated distinct visions of the republic: constitutional, radical democratic, and emancipatory, raising enduring questions about legitimacy, inclusion, violence, and the sustainability of political order. So what is a republic? What are the things that we've covered, whether it be when Jack was looking at Rome, when I was looking at the English Civil War? Well, the concept of a republic, originating in the Roman Res Publica, underwent a profound transformation between the 16th and 18th centuries, shifting from a model centered on mixed government and civic virtue to one increasingly defined by sovereignty, rights, and representation, reflecting broader changes in political anthropology and in theories of human nature, heavily influenced in particular by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who we looked at in the first series on liberty. Early modern republicanism, as articulated by Machiavelli, emphasized the tension between liberty and corruption, arguing that republics depended upon virtuous citizens who were capable of resisting factional decay, a concern that would later reappear with 18th century debates over party and opposition, which is what I'm looking at in my PhD research. Enlightenment thinkers such as Rousseau reconceptualized the republic through the idea of the general will, linking political authority to collective moral unity rather than institutional balance, thereby introducing a more radical and potentially coercive understanding of what sovereignty is. Intellectual historians in my field, J.G.A. Pocock, argue that modern republicanism represents a synthesis of classical civic humanism, Protestant moral theology, and Enlightenment social theory, producing a language in which liberty, virtue, commerce, and history were in constant and often unstable tension with one another. So at the bottom, we've got that transition from those kind of Roman ideals, which you've discussed, Jack, much more about virtue, about a republic can only thrive if each citizen is sort of educated in a virtuous way. And I don't know if you wanted to expand on that maybe slightly in terms of the Roman interpretation of the republic.
Yeah, I mean, they were interested. Where we get the word the Commonwealth from, that's a more accurate translation.
Which you then used by the English Republicans.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the core idea was that we have a binding ethic, a binding sense of what justice is, and the constitution of the state sort of follows from there. And you're asking about education.
Yeah, in terms of like sort of cultivation of the participant in the republic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they had where classical education comes from. The end of education was seen to be civic vocation, civic duty. So you study philosophy, poetry, rhetoric, the art of speaking. All these things in order to become a comprehensive individual and statesman, in whatever office that might take.
And for someone like Cicero, the Republic couldn't be revived if virtue wasn't revived in the civil.
No, indeed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas by the time of the Civil War in England, it's much more of a sort of institutional shift rather than a moral one. It's much more of changing the structures of power in themselves rather than reigniting some sort of, I mean, there's obviously the theological side to what the Puritans were doing, but it's much more a sort of structural change, would you say, a structural shift compared to that?
Exactly. Yes. So, Rome has some ideas about checks, what we call checks and balances. They have the triumvirate and the consulate, sort of two the opposing factions within the government, which kept it more or less conservative. Maybe the discussion becomes much more technical in modernity as a consequence of heightened concerns about the abuse of power and the various forms that can take. Because in the English Civil War, not only do you have a civil war to overthrow a monarch, but then you have all kinds of questions raised about who kind of figure who comes in his place, who we expect to be a Republican, but turned out to be functionally no different from the monarch who preceded him. So
and is actually offered the crown.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So but it's interesting to me that Rousseau seems to be an anomaly here, because he's referring the political authority back again to moral unity, rather than institutional balance, and that's because Rousseau is especially enamored with the Roman authors.
Yes, very much.
We read the social contract, and Rousseau talked a lot about how things are structured in the Roman context. They give you an overview of the whole constitution of Rome, and a preface to his view of the ideal state. And I wonder why that's different for him in his time.
He's obviously taking part in this sort of battle between the ancients and moderns that flourishes during the Enlightenment period. And he is enamored by Roman traditions of republicanism, but he's also enamored by theology. If you look at something like the Discourse on Inequality, it's really portraying this kind of Garden of Eden idea of what man was in nature without the religious. So, he was very much a man of his time and a unique figure who I'm sure we'll come back to time and time again. But if we move on from the intellectual foundations of a republic, we need to look at the context of the Atlantic revolutions. So this period from 1760 to 1804 can be understood as a moment of systemic crisis in the Atlantic world, driven by imperial overreach, fiscal strain, and the circulation of radical ideas. Again, something that we've looked at in the debates between Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke, with revolutions emerging as both ideological projects and practical responses to governance failures. The 7 Years' War left Britain and France heavily indebted, leading to new taxation regimes such as the Stamp Act in 1765, which provoked colonial resistance and raised fundamental questions about representation, sovereignty, and legitimacy of imperial authority. Revolutionary ideas spread through an expanding print culture, with pamphlets, newspapers, and political tracts circulating across borders. For example, Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776 sold over 100,000 copies within months, illustrating the scale of ideological mobilization. And poor Edmund Burke's one, what was it? 10,000.
Which I thought was very impressive until you told me that number.
Historiographically, R.R. Palmer presents these events as a unified democratic movement, with Daniel Armitage instead emphasising the plurality of constitutional experiments and the importance of imperial and global contexts in shaping divergent outcomes. So what was the American Republic? What did the revolution bring about? Well, the American Revolution, beginning in 1775 and culminating in independence in 1783, produced a republic grounded in written constitutionalism, federalism, and the rule of law, but reflecting both Enlightenment theory and colonial political practice. The Declaration of Independence in 76 articulated a universalist language of natural rights, this idea that all men are created equal, while simultaneously coexisting with entrenched systems of slavery and exclusion, revealing a tension between the ideological aspirations of the revolutionaries and the social reality of their day. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 created a federal structure designed to balance competing interests with mechanisms such as bicameralism and checks and balances to mitigate factional conflict, a central concern in 18th century political thought. As Gordon S. Wood argues, the American Revolution transformed the nature of political authority by replacing hierarchical deference with a more egalitarian, though still limited, conception of citizenship rooted in representation and consent. So what was American Republican thought, the actual ideas that were the seedbed of this revolution? Well, they comprised around faction, liberty, and religion. The problem of faction, understood as the division of society into competing interests, was central to American Republican thought, with James Madison arguing in the Federalist No. 10 that an extended republic could control faction by multiplying interests and preventing domination by any single group. This was an issue that was at the heart of most medieval political thought on the continent leading up to the American Revolution, the idea of how do you contain disparate ideas, how do you contain people who have maybe a fringe view. You know, we see during the English Civil War the rise of the Quakers or the Methodists on the religious side, or we see the rise of the Levellers and the Diggers on the political side. How do you keep the body politic healthy all the way, you know, back into talking when we've talked about Montaigne and people like that? If you're looking at medieval political theorists, often a faction in a body politic, because it's analysed in this very corporeal way in relation to the physical, a faction in politics all the way up until the 18th century and even further, arguably, is seen as a cancer, is seen as something that you need to cut out to keep the body politic alive. But America wanted to embrace the idea of faction. This approach marked a departure from classical republicanism, which sought to eliminate these factions through civic virtue, instead embracing pluralism as a structural feature of a modern society, a shift highly relevant to the emergence of loyal opposition in Britain. Religion played a complex role, with many Americans viewing the Republic as part of a providential order. Yet the Constitution and its separation of church and state represented a significant innovation in political theology. Intellectual historian Bernard Bailey emphasizes that American political discourse was shaped by a deep-seated fear of corruption and conspiracy inherited from earlier Whig opposition thought, linking the American case to the broader 18th century debates about power and liberty. So what is in these Federalist Papers? This is one of the readings that I've put on here. Yeah, you can read it your own accord. I'll read it out. From this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. A common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by a majority of the whole, a communication and concert result from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Hence it is that such democracies have even been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would at the same time be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. So what do we think we're getting from that? What's this idea of faction emerging with the American Republic, or any other questions about the American Republic and what this could be saying about what the American Republic is trying to do? Sure.
It's quite a dense text. So this is the problem that you. So a common passion or interest for the military can be felt by ignoring the whole. So it can be felt the nothing to check the inducement to sacrifice. So this is about how do you ameliorate faction, essentially.
Yeah.
Because faction has been inexperienced. Sort of, I mean, you can look at England, as you mentioned, post Charles I, the fragmentation of the political body. It's like half a dozen like prominent sects and a dozen more minor ones. It's really quite intimidating, and I guess it's not conducive to sound policy. Which it may be counterintuitive, because we think, well, you know, democracy means, well, you know, everyone has a say, and you know, when we hear that, and that there's truth to that, but then also.
But if it exists it's like I guess if you go back to something like when we read The Republic, for example, that sort of duality with the brain, that if there's a part of the brain that's not functioning correctly, it needs to be remedied, it needs to be part of the whole, like in the politics in the state, that if there's a part of it, it can't maintain a faction. If there is a faction, it needs to be subsumed. But what is he saying? But how is faction going to operate in this new constitution?
Let's see. I don't know what he proposed to do about that in that text.
So if you see, so you want a unity and you also want diversity. Unity is institutional. You have the constitution, you have the form of government, you have the forms of representation. The diversity is the faction, many of which can be considered good and non-conflicting, some of which are conflicting and perhaps bad as well. So the question is, how do you resolve those tensions between factions or groups or whatever the communities are? And I don't know what the answer was then, but the modern answer is procedural. You have processes by which factions resolve things in court, in campaigns, in political arenas. So I'd say it's actually separating off structure from process.
No, definitely.
I don't know that was an idea at the time. It's an idea.
No, I would say that certainly feeds into what Madison is saying, and Madison is ultimately endorsing faction as a positive feature of the emergent constitution more broadly. But again, it's about defending the, I guess, the not majoritarian, but the substantive views of what I guess we today call the centre ground, whether it be the centre of the Republicans and Democrats, but that wasn't what that was at the time, against fringes that could overspeak and represent a threat to the Constitution, whether they be radical loyalists to the old forces of Britain, or whether they be radical fringes of kind of anarchic revolutionaries. It's the same debate that's taking place with scholars in England at the time about the emergence of the Whigs and Tories, and where can the functions of parties and established factions lie within a constitution? Well, as long as they keep a balance on one another, they don't get too emotive, they don't get too taken by ideological passion and dogma, then they can contain one another and contribute in a sort of counterbalanced way to a better constitution through the checks and balances that factions bring in and of themselves.
And one interesting challenge is, how do you retain deference to the constitution with the need sometimes to actually change it to evolve, to move with the times? And that movement with the times can lead to factional opportunism that leads to conversation.
No, completely. And I guess in this scenario, it's obviously quite unique in the sense of a very entrenched written constitution that obviously emerges at this time for factions to operate within that. I don't know if anyone else has any other points on the reading. Jay?
No, I think I concur with Bruce. So you've got an underlying sense that you need a unity to operate in a context where there's going to be factions. You need the mechanism to draw them back into the fold. That's probably going to be partly educational, but partly different processes and opportunity to have hearings and so forth. I think it goes so fundamental to actually questioning the fabric out of which your society is constituted. Then obviously that's a whole other question entirely. It's one that's of interest to Edmund Burke in the French context, where they radically revise their constitution and found on new principles entirely. What is the legitimacy of that? What principles are we referring to?
Which, of course, as we've seen, I mean, in many ways, America maintains the bedrock structure, bicameralism, all of these things from its former colonial overlord, Britain, and wishes the factions to operate within that sort of structure. and yeah, to contain the more fringe elements that would threaten the framework of a republic like the one that's emerging in America. Which is obviously why someone like Burke supports the American Revolution, but then opposes the French Revolution, because the French Revolution, as we will go on to take a look at, could actually threaten the possibility of any disunity at all, in Burke's eyes. And for the Americans, you need to have faction to maintain the state, but it needs to operate within the established constitution that sets the parameters within which each faction established as a party will operate.
I think quite critical of sort of lauded politics as well.
Yes.
The personal privilege as
Yeah.
well.
Exactly, which is another thing that obviously contextually he's writing against, which is the idea that these kind of established families, you have the emergence of the electoral college, for example, that people are actually going to represent the votes cast. And this is why the Americans still have it, because the electoral college was needed for such a big geographical space. You needed to send people on horseback to go and tell the central authority how the people have voted across the land. So that's why they still have the electoral college. And that sort of idea of what had come before the revolution, that was these kind of established families who had
Not
lived.
just individuals.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Who had lived there the longest in terms of those who had gone over earlier in the sort of 17th century, early 17th century, and had established themselves. They shouldn't be the ones dominating the political process, and it should be the voice of the people represented through these factions emergent as parties at this time. I'm not used to this setup. Should be. But what were the hidden costs of the American Republic? Well, the American Republic's commitment to liberty was profoundly limited, with slavery expanding after independence. The enslaved population grew from approximately 700,000 in 1790 to over 1 million by 1800, illustrating the entrenchment of racial hierarchy within a republican framework. Indigenous populations faced systematic dispossession as westward expansion accelerated following independence, leading to the loss of millions of acres of land and destruction of existing political structures and social structures. Political participation remained restricted, with voting rights generally limited to property-owning white men, representing perhaps 10 or 20% of the overall population in the late 18th century. As Edmund Morgan argues, American republicanism was characterized by a paradox in which liberty and equality for some were made possible by the exploitation and the exclusion of the other. So, to France. So the French Revolution, we've all heard of the storming of the Bastille and Bastille Day. It began in 1789. It emerged from a crisis of monarchy divided by fiscal insolvency, social inequality, and intellectual critique, culminating in the abolition of monarchy and the establishment of a republic in 1792. France is a very unique case as far as I'm concerned, and I think Jack as well, in terms of the religious, the fact that no reformation, so to speak, takes place in France at any point. There is a split in the Catholic Church between Gallicans and the Roman Catholic Church, but there is never a reformation in France. There's never a this is me speaking as an intellectual historian and overblowing the point, but there's never a divergence in thought between one-track mindedness, not to be nasty, but one-track mindedness in the sense of having one unified voice, which is the Catholic Church. There's never an established threat that makes politics think separately, think that there could be established divergence within the political sphere. When there is, we see the result, which is the Huguenots and the figure that I focus on in my PhD, Paul de Rapin, who comes to England to write the history of England, is one of those Huguenot refugees. And he wants to hold a mirror up to France because of the fact that there was never any opportunity for the French to express their disparate beliefs, views, whether it be religious or political. And this is a problem, I think, that the French Revolution doesn't resolve and perhaps continues. So France's population of approximately 28 million, combined with deep divisions between estates, created a far more volatile and complex social environment than in America, contributing to the radicalization of the revolution. Key events such as the storming of the Bastille in 1789 and the execution of Louis XVI in 1793 symbolized the transfer of sovereignty from king to the people, while also intensifying political conflict and instability. Historian Francois Furet interprets the revolution as driven by an ideological commitment to equality that ultimately destabilized political order by undermining traditional forms of authority. There he is again. Just have a sip quickly. French republicanism was heavily influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose concept of the general will posited that true freedom consists in obedience to laws one has prescribed for oneself collectively, thereby linking liberty to moral unity rather than institutional constraint. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789 articulated universal principles of liberty and equality, yet their application became increasingly contested, particularly in the context of war and internal dissent between the départements, as they're now called. Fun pub quiz fact is that France has the most time zones of any country on Earth, which I got wrong. Political participation expanded dramatically with mass mobilization through clubs and assemblies, yet this participatory politics also contributed to instability and the escalation of conflict. Intellectual historian Keith Baker highlights how revolutionary language itself reshaped political possibilities, with concepts such as nation and citizen acquiring new powerful meanings. So this is the preamble from the Declaration of the Rights. The representatives of the French people constituted as a national assembly, and considering that ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the rights of man are the sole causes of public misfortunes and governmental corruption, have resolved to set forth in a solemn declaration the natural, inalienable, and sacred rights of man, so that being by constantly present to all the members of the social body, this declaration may always remind them of their rights and duties, so that by being liable at every moment to comparison with the aim of any and all political institutions, the act of the legislative and executive powers may be the more fully respected, and so that by being founded henceforward on simple and incontestable principles, the demands of the citizens may always tend towards maintaining the constitution and the general welfare. Fascinating text, isn't it? This is supposed to be read intriguingly by any layman, so I'm not really sure at the time how someone collecting potatoes was necessarily expected to understand the language that this was being written in, but it is also there on the artwork that was put up, I think in the Pantheon, for the Declaration of the Rights of Man. What do we get? What sense do we get of what this republic is getting to be from the preamble of the Declaration?
There's the rights of man, not the rights of French people.
Rights of man and the citizen, the full name.
Yeah, but are they universal? Do they feel these are the rights of?
The idea is that they're universalizable. 10 days.
Yeah.
Addiction. The founded henceforward on simple and incontestable principles that the demand of the citizens may always tend towards maintaining the general welfare. So it is, the sort of order towards the preservation of the whole.
Yeah. Not much room for faction.
Seems significant. No, indeed. There's not much room for faction. So they do.
Which obviously there is from the start of the revolution, faction between the Jacobins and the Girondins, the radicals and the moderates of the revolution. So to say that there needs to be unity in the whole is already making quite a statement.
Yeah, then it's the ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the universal right that have caused all.
Which everyone knows. Everyone ploughing in the field knows their inalienable rights of universal declaration.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, you could, these people think along the lines of natural law. I mean, they feel these things are self-evident to rational beings with conscience, and I think that's fair enough. But I mean, it's quite a loaded. So I mean, so for instance, I mean, to the extent that there are economic problems in a country, so how much is that to do with the fact that you have rejected universal principles of human dignity? It's like, quite. So maybe sometimes that is the case, but obviously you can see the kind of that are already embedded in that sort of attitude toward policies. You can see where sort of more radical wing of the sort of 19th century goes.
Yes, very much so. And we've discussed this before, Jack. I know in terms of the centralizing of power in this way that you then see with the Russian Revolution as well, in the sense of how do you implement these universal rights particularly in an economic scenario, which you see with the Gost plan in the Soviet Union as well, with trying to basically geometrically divvy up by squares the land and production rates. Exactly. The same thing happens in France at this point.
Exactly.
By sort of trying to implement universal rights in an economic way.
In a geometric way.
Yeah, in a geometric way, which is not really something that can be done. It's quite difficult.
It doesn't reflect the reality. So I mean, in a country you have very different geographical circumstances, resources, cultures, languages, even, and there's some sort of very naive rationalist assumption baked into the heart of their administrative planning, and they're legislating that this is all just the same everywhere. So it's because they uproot themselves from tradition and experience and have taught them that.
But there's a lot that they have been taught, I think, that comes across in the ideals. But there's a lot that they miss out. So we've mentioned, for example, the influence of Rousseau. Now, Rousseau believed in the breaking up. Stephanie, you will know about this in terms of the ideal of the Canton of Geneva, right? The idea that large states ultimately need to break up into smaller states because they can't function as large states effectively. And with each revolution, other than the American one, we can come back to a little bit of this, but the revolutionaries seem to maintain the sort of both obviously the geographical, but also this kind of political assumption that large states will succeed, that there's a boldness in the unity of a very proud large state. But if you're a revolutionary working from Paris, there's probably very little chance of you effectively running states that you've never been to, counties that you've never been to, that you will have never experienced. It's probably going to be very difficult to maintain both the rights, but also just the effective maintenance of an economy in those areas, and any kind of governmental sort of systems, which Rousseau directly calls for there to be put to an end of, that small states are the ideal states, that you need to break up mammoth ones. And this is part of my old professor's work on the end of Enlightenment, the idea that these large states, when they went through revolutions, that tried to take Enlightenment ideals, ultimately kind of killed Enlightenment ideals, because it just led to what we see, Caesar figures. We see it with, whether you go back to Cromwell, George Washington could have been one, but it's the only example of someone who returns to his plough like Cincinnatus. But with Robespierre and then ultimately Napoleon in the French context. And they maintain large states, they maintain them, and they take complete consolidated power within an individual because they think that's the way to fully realize the revolution and thereby kill Enlightenment. Sorry, that sounded a bit gloomy. Move on from there.
Napoleon's is a good book.
Interesting. What have you skimmed? Or?
Did a podcast on
Oh,
this.
okay.
Painful thing to check.
And what's the general thesis?
I thought it was going to be, because he's a real historian, but it's very strategic on why there's not been leaders like Napoleon that's been developed since.
Okay.
A lot of that
Yeah.
stems from they've not had the ideological charge because no one's wanted to
Yeah.
put all the eggs in one basket and,
Yeah,
sort of-
yeah.
and lead through.
Interesting. But he wouldn't consider, like in the Russian context, he wouldn't consider that a sort of parallel then, sort of Lenin.
This
Mm.
would be my counter argument.
It's because surely they have an ideological charge, even if it's very different to an age, because obviously someone like Napoleon is imbued with Enlightenment ideals that circle of thought. But no, interesting.
The wars didn't quite come for them. That's the only difference.
True. Yes, that is true.
Yes.
No, interesting.
But of course, it approaches it from a very naval perspective as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Brace yourself.
Oh.
So violence, war, and the collapse of the French Republic, going on to what Daisy's just raised, essentially. The reign of terror between 1793 and 1794 saw approximately 17,000 executions by guillotine, alongside widespread violence and civil conflict, such as the Vendée, reflecting the radicalization of revolutionary politics. Revolutionary France engaged in continuous warfare from 1792, mobilizing over 1 million soldiers, which both sustained the Republic and contributed to its militarization and eventual transformation into the empire under Napoleon. The instability of the revolutionary government, combined with external threats, paved the way for Napoleon Bonaparte's coup in 1799, marking the end of the First Republic. And just before you all got here, we were watching a clip from Napoleon with mixed opinions on the makeup of that film. But as Shine Sharma argues, violence was not merely a byproduct of the revolution, but an intrinsic element of its political logic. Check, we haven't got any questions, no. So, what about a vassal of the French Republic and its reaction to the Enlightenment ideals? Well, the Haitian Republic, 1791 to 1804. The Haitian Revolution began in 1791 in Saint-Domingue, the wealthiest colony in the Caribbean, producing vast quantities of sugar and coffee through a brutal system of plantation slavery involving approximately 500,000 enslaved people. The revolution was shaped by local conditions and global influences, including the French Revolution itself and Enlightenment ideas that precursored it. Yet it developed into a distinct and radical movement centered on emancipation and racial equality. Haiti declared independence in 1804, becoming the first Black republic and fundamentally challenging European assumptions about race, civilization, and political capacity. Historian Laurent Dubois emphasizes that the Haitian Revolution represents the most complete realization of the universalist claims of the Enlightenment. So what was the thought that underlay it? Haitian Republican thought, freedom and universality. Haitian Republicanism extended the principles of liberty and equality to their logical conclusion by abolishing slavery and asserting the political agency of formerly enslaved people, thereby redefining the bounds of citizenship. Leaders such as Toussaint Louverture combined Enlightenment ideals with practical military and political strategies, creating a new form of leadership rooted in both European and African traditions. The Haitian Constitution of 1805 rejected racial hierarchy and colonial domination, asserting a vision of sovereignty grounded in universal emancipation. Intellectual historian Susan Buck-Moss argues that Haiti exposes the limitations of European Enlightenment thought by demonstrating that its universal claims were realized most fully outside of Europe. So now we've got some writings of Toussaint Louverture. Jack, Dara, and I remember Toussaint Louverture from a poem. I don't know if you would, Daisy. Jonathan Agar's poem on checking out my history.
Yes.
Which was a GCSE poem that was said.
It's really racking the brain.
Long time.
The GCSE set, wasn't it?
Yeah.
15 that we had to rehearse.
Yeah. But an icon in himself. So the writings of Toussaint Louverture. When the people of Saint-Domingue first tasted the fruit of liberty that they hold from the equity of France, when to the violent upheavals of the revolution that announced it succeeded the pleasures of tranquility, when finally the rule of law took the place of anarchy under which the unfortunate colony had too long suffered, what fatality can have led the greatest enemy of its prosperity and of our happiness still to dare to threaten us with the return of slavery. So that was a letter to the French Directory in 1792, if you remember, toward the start of the Haitian revolt. But then we have a letter here from 1802, nearing the end of the revolt and the Declaration of Independence. We have no other resource than destruction and flame. Bear in mind that the soil bathed with our sweat must not furnish our enemies with the smallest aliment. I wanted to check that that was spelt right because I was really confused that it said ailment, and I was thinking, why would he care about the ailment of the French? But aliment meaning benefit.
Oh, okay.
So there we are. Tear up the roads with shot, throw corpses and horses into all the fountains, burn and annihilate everything, in order that those who have come to reduce us to slavery may have before their eyes the image of hell which they deserve. There's a little bit of a change of tone, I'd say, between those two letters. They're sort of more engaging with these Enlightenment nice concepts with the Republic, and then turning to fully fledged violence.
Who did that use?
I think just a friend. I don't know if he's a friend who's living in France. Could be a friend living in France. Yeah, but they would be also on Haiti as well. But I'm pretty sure living in France. So I think, yeah. What do we get? Either comparison between those two excerpts, one excerpt itself.
So can I ask about the comparison between, so we have the previous excerpt which are, I think it was liberty, equality, fraternity as the principles that should be deployed in the far corners of France to provide unity of thought and so on. And you have Haiti, which I think is a colony of France at the time. And yet there seems to be a clear dissonance between that and the need for them to actually have a revolution at all.
So what happens in the interim, that's why I was joking about the 10 days, is essentially Robespierre, the leader of the French Republic during the Terror, is in many ways a radical, right? He wants to guillotine people. Yes, he wants to let the blood flow through France, but he himself is a radical in the sense of universal emancipation. He does believe that everyone under France's authority should be free. When he's done away with and executed himself, the French come to their, well, as far as they're concerned, come to their senses and think, look, we need to stop the violence in France, and also that stuff about emancipating the slaves. That was also all a little bit crazy. So he's gone. So obviously, in many people's eyes, Robespierre's gone, that's great. But also his radical views of the revolution are also gone. And particularly then when the empire comes, those ideas are essentially done away with. But they do live for a fleeting time. And actually, another interesting figure who is at the Directory and at the French Senate during the early days of the revolution is Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham makes a lot of calls to end slavery. And he says, you have the power right now to end slavery and to emancipate your colonies, because he, in this Rousseauan view, believes that large states, imperial powers can't survive, that they will fracture. And he says, do it now, untether them. The French say that's very nice and send him on his way. But he is made an honorary senator or something.
It just seems that the principles themselves have little power
completely,
unless harnessed to someone who has all the power and uses them to extend their, because it's about scale. At the end of the day, it seems they're about the scale of what they can control, what they can hold power over.
Certainly. And
they can then vary the principles. So actually, individual people interpreting those principles are powerless, and therefore interpretations have no value. It comes back just to the powerful deciding how to spin it.
It does, and it comes back to the idea that we were discussing on the American one about faction, because factions not only parties, right? But faction, if you don't have parties, you don't have factions that can establish themselves as part of the constitution. Then you don't have factions in terms of individuals on a daily basis. You can't have people saying exactly what you're saying, which is interpreting it for themselves. This also comes back, you might want to respond to this, Jack, but this comes back to my point about the fact that there was no Reformation in France, that as much as obviously it was a threat to the Catholic Church, what it did was allow Catholics during Counter-Reformation to accept the idea that they were Protestants and to try and work out sort of common discourse. The fact that France never has a Reformation means that it struggles to allow people who think differently to the majoritarian view, even if that is a revolutionary one in its way.
It doesn't require the process of actually working through those.
Exactly, and accepting that there could be something that wants to establish itself as different to the broader thought. I don't know, Jack, if you're.
I mean, it seems plausible. I mean, I don't know enough about the French situation to comment, but you're connecting that to what
The fact that individuals, say nations, can interpret these universal ideals that have obviously been enshrined in that Declaration of the Rights of Man differently to the established opinion, which is that actually, no, we won't emancipate our colonies, we won't, because obviously universal freedom should be interpreted by anyone as I have universal freedom, but they don't.
So because they didn't have an experience with the Reformation.
There was a lack of abilities in the centralized powers of Paris to think, oh, well, yeah, actually, they could be right. Why are we not
That's
facilitating
very
their
interesting
freedom?
because I mean another point to draw on that is the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Which
Yeah,
is,
yeah.
Very emblematic. It's
Yeah.
very violent suppression
Yeah.
of faction, and this is like maybe in that same spirit.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
Mm.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on the two excerpts that we have?
So the interplay of religion as well, and considering man as a concept of who within that, and especially in that period, these were not men, these were property.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's such an ideological shift to try and introduce that alongside major reform in government and in policy that you can see that they've gone a step too far, and that there is this underlying racism that still retains out in some places in the world. That they can get over it for their fellow women as they see it. They cannot actually see it as universal, and that what we understand as universal is clearly very different.
Definitely, and I think
to them at the period. Which,
no, completely. I'd agree, and I'd imagine that Jack would probably have a point about France today as a secular state having problems with that, because in some of the discussions I've had with the chap that I interviewed on toleration, thank you. Limited tolerance.
No,
After him. He'll come to me.
Okay.
But this question of even a modern French state as a secular state obviously seems like an Enlightenment ideal, but then how does a secular state integrate elements that reject secularity, right? Or secularism? How does a modern Enlightenment French state, when it bans the burqa, for example, and says it's doing it in the mindset of Enlightenment ideals, well, is it setting its parameters and saying everything else is a threat, we don't want anything else? So there are a lot of questions that this kind of brings up, even in the modern day. I feel really bad that I can't remember his name now.
Well, we can look it up.
Yeah.
I don't know, did France actually during the revolution produce an agrarian revolution as well? Was there land reform? Because what the thread I'm following now is the difference between gardens in England with the enclosures, making estates very big in England, and in France they have this system called seigneurialism. Manorialism. I can't say it. Manorialism. Yes. Thank you. Where, I mean, the people working there had to do corvée, so you have the stupid situation where actually the peasants were starving, those who produced the food, because they were doing all the corvée.
Yeah.
And they were basically like slaves, not big difference.
Completely. No, I mean, I was going to say, I mean, I know that there's a lot of agricultural issues in a similar way with the Russian Revolution as well, but sort of these structural, very rigid policies of production ultimately don't turn into a reality on the ground, and ultimately lead to random distribution. You've also got to remember that there was a lot of poverty as a result of just ongoing military campaign. That anything was produced was sent to the front, and nothing was really there. This bread that was promised was never really there, because the ongoing military campaign meant that everything had to constantly be sent to the troops to maintain the conflict. But I would say that that is a massive factor in why the empire comes about as well, agricultural failure.
They didn't have an agrarian reform.
I wouldn't say in any particular sort of, well, probably an attempt at it is what I'd say in terms of this very geometric way of viewing how things were done, but not in any kind of particularly modernising way, with the aim of modernising, but not really coming to fruition. And yeah, and certainly a reliance on the colonies as well to facilitate that in terms of the amount that needed to go to the troops, which is why again they're reluctant to part with the colonies, and have been reluctant to this day. Ultimately, that the departments still send delegates to the French Senate. Yes, sorry.
I think it's interesting. I mean, I don't know much about this topic, but I think it's interesting that between those two dates, if you just go back.
Yes, yeah. How do I do that?
That's, I think precisely in 1794, I think, or 1795 is when Bentham writes the Panopticon letters.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that it's precisely that that year, or in the interim between these two letters and following the revolution and everything, that the birth of a modern prison emerges as a modern punishment, which is obviously different from the guillotine or kind of the previous form of punishment. It's just instant, right?
Yeah.
And now we have this idea of, okay, well, the reform of the prisoner, and that is the theatricality of punishment as well.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And yeah, I was trying to think. But obviously, and Bentham at that time, it's interesting that he takes such issue with the colonies in France, because at the time he has a bit, I don't know how much you've read of Bentham.
My master's thesis.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Okay. Well, you can correct me. But he, for criticising the French, he has a bit of a failure of oversight in terms of the British situation, which is that he takes his ideas of the Panopticon and thinks that Australia is going to be this brilliant sort of concept of the Panopticon, but it completely fails to sort of acknowledge the well-documented by his time presence of Aboriginal people. And he also seems to lack this ability to, with his obviously Enlightenment infused views of justice, he fails to see the massive flaw in people of the sort of later Enlightenment ilk, which is that they take these ideas, but then they completely miss out the fact that there are people who are not allowed to participate in, I guess, what we call the social contract. And in Australia, he thinks that this idea of a kind of penal colony that's going to regulate people's lives is going to be a great kind of realization of his ideas, but then doesn't mention the fact that there are people there that will be obviously massively impacted by an establishment of such a colony. But no, that is interesting. Denis Lacan. That's the name. Denis Lacan is the one. Thank you. You guys just take a pause. Jack, anyone else?
For sure.
I mean, the Enlightenment also kind of dismantles this one previous myth in a way, and establishes a new myth of this rationalist. I mean, this is a very kind of Dorian argument. I don't know. I think that was something that when I was doing my master's thesis, I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
It's also materially manifested in the prison.
Yeah. I know that is interesting. Well, hopefully we might be able to do. We haven't actually covered Bentham at any point, have we? No, we did do one on liberalism. We covered Mill and sort of mentioned Bentham and his dad in passing, but but no, we'll come back to it. It'll be a special session that we'll run after Hegel, which Jack does want to run, but wants to get opinions on whether or not to run.
Bruce, I think you can. Okay, I'll do Hegel.
Mad Sweetaway as well. Done a lot of work on development prisons over there. Definitely knows much more about Swedish.
Well, the costs and the isolation of the Haitian Republic, what we've sort of been discussing. The Haitian Revolution resulted in massive loss of life, with estimates ranging from 100,000 to 200,000 deaths, as we can see in this lovely chart that I found. In terms of black population, 200,000, French soldiers, 75,000, British soldiers also involved, 45,000, and white colonists on the land, 25,000. Haiti faced immediate international isolation, with major powers refusing recognition of France, imposing a crippling indemnity of 150 million francs in 1825, which had long-term economic consequences on the state. The collapse of plantation agriculture led to a significant decline in exports, reshaping the economic and social structure of the new republic. As CLR James argues, and I was mentioning him earlier, Haiti's achievement was both revolutionary and tragic, highlighting the costs of radical emancipation in a hostile global system. Wasn't ready for it, I guess.
I don't understand the second paragraph.
Yeah.
Haiti faced immediate international isolation
from those in alignment with continental powers. Because there was also British presence within Haiti. I haven't gone too much into the complications of the lead up to Haiti, but the presence, as you see, in terms of like the British presence and the French presence, the rejection of Haiti because of what it did and the threat. I mean, imagine Edmund Burke writing about this revolution. I mean, he wasn't happy about the French doing what they did, but to do it in an even more radical way, and for it to be at a time where obviously racially it would have been seen as completely kind of a inspirational threat to colonies of all nations. So potentially in India, across Africa, whether you be German, whether you be British, whether you be French, you don't want this to be a successful republic. You want to quash it because otherwise everyone's gonna follow suit. So that's why, in that sense.
It was that I had misread France imposing as France had imposed.
Okay, I see.
Had been imposed on France.
No. There were no international morals at this time. No one was imposing it for the treatment of Haiti.
Why that led to the Haiti being discriminated against if France was as well. So anyway.
Yeah.
What you find.
Perfect. So what are republics and their limits? We've just passed the Ides of March. We've all made it through. The divergent trajectories of the American, French, and Haitian republics reflect differences in scale, social structure, economic foundations, and international context, illustrating that republicanism is not a single model, but a spectrum of political possibilities. The American Republic achieved stability through institutional design and relative social cohesion, while the French Republic collapsed under the pressure of ideological radicalism and war. And Haiti faced these external isolation periods despite its internal transformation. So these cases raise broader questions about the relationship between liberty and order, inclusion and stability, and the role of violence. This idea that my old professor in his book, The End of Enlightenment, the idea that revolutions always bring Caesar figures, that there are very few examples other than, say, in America and with Cincinnatus, that someone takes complete power and hands it back over willingly to reform the republic. Historian David Scott suggests that each revolution must be understood in relation to its own historical conditions, conceptual problems, rather than as part of a single teleological narrative of progress. So the idea that you can just transfer revolutionary ideas into another context and they will work completely the same as previously. So what are the problems of the modern republic? Well, this is a cartoon actually from the day, published in England. The emergence of modern republics between 1776 and 1804 represents a fundamental shift in political thought, redefining sovereignty, citizenship, and legitimacy in ways that still shape contemporary politics. Yet these revolutions also reveal the tensions and contradictions inherent in republicanism, particularly regarding exclusion, violence, and the limits of universalism. Study of these republics is therefore not merely historical but conceptual, offering insights into the enduring challenges of a democratic governance and political legitimacy. As Hannah Arendt argues, the true significance of these revolutions lies in their redefinition of political action and the possibilities of collective freedom, even as their outcomes remain deeply contested. So looking ahead, from republics to railways, and then revolution again. Having explored the birth of the modern republic between 1776 and 1804, we now move into the long 19th century, where the great question shifts from who should rule to the rather more pressing who earns, works, and profits. Industrialization gathers pace through breakthroughs in steam power, textiles, and transport, most symbolically in the railway, which quite literally reshapes space, time, and society, drawing labour into expanding industrial cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, Sheffield, and Leeds. Next time we meet, Karl Marx, who, building on the ideas that Jack will discuss at some point, Hegel reimagines history not as the progress of reason, but as an ongoing class struggle rooted in material and economic life. If tonight has been about rights, sovereignty, and revolution, next time we turn to railways, industrial, and capital, and discover that the revolution, it seems, is far from over from these 18th and early 19th century ones that we've done tonight. But yeah, unless there's any questions, that will be about it for this evening. Thank you.
Yeah,
I don't know if anyone has any general questions or things they'd like
Any
to raise.
questions online?
Let me check. No, nothing.
One of these saying that violence was an intrinsic part of the revolution. Why?
I guess as far as I'm concerned, in this idea that ultimately, because of the way that revolutions happen, they're often led by a relatively small group in most examples. They're often not from the ground up. The only ones that are successful, I guess, are the ones that are ground up. America, arguably Haiti, depending on where you sit on the success of the revolution. Because they want to consolidate power and they're threatened, they often have to use the military or the structure that is left of the previous government's military to entrench power. Again, we see it in England with the new model army. We see it with the military in France consolidating power and threatening the directorate. So ultimately they have to, because they come from often quite small groups of people, and they need something to bolster their opinion. None of these revolutions happen by democratic consent. So I guess that would be the reason.
So it's the absence of I find it interesting that the idea of process of change, and obviously violence is an alternative to political process. And
exactly.
Politics by the means and like that. But also it seems to be that people who have power and feel threatened don't hand it over willingly.
No.
So I can see how Haiti, having seen, I would call it the hypocrisy of French principles.
Yeah.
And having said "me too" and then being rejected, said, well, how else do we achieve the same? We like these ideas. So the ideas generate the impetus for change. The resistance generates the violence.
Yeah.
Violence usurps or not powers.
Yeah.
And then begins again, of course. And unless you then embed proper processes, democratic or otherwise, into
exactly
how your institutions change.
And I wonder, Jack, also whether some of the success does come from this idea, going back to the ancient idea of a civic participation in the Republic, right? The fact that, even if we are contesting numbers between our passions, Paine and Burke, the fact that Paine's pamphlets were obviously permeating the actual common discourse, the level of engagement with the ideas before the revolution in somewhere like America is very different to the peasantry, say, in France. And later, I would say, similar to the result of the first election of the provisional government in Russia after the revolution is that the socialist this is very boring, socialist revolutionaries win, peasantry, they're all voting for the socialist revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks get less, and then the Bolsheviks say, well, we're not happy with that, so we'll scrap that election and consolidate power with the military, right? So is the only example of somewhere like America an example of where civic virtue or at least civic education and engagement with ideas, because it precursors the revolution itself, is able to maybe ground itself in the populace a bit more?
It's possible. I mean, Haynes' work obviously influenced America, but it also influenced France.
Yeah. I mean, he's imprisoned in France.
Right. So
because he supports the French Revolution, which shows again.
It is the same idea, but they didn't have a very different. Yeah, they didn't have a very different result. I mean, you could actually really the French Revolution really come from the peasants? Did it really come from the agrarian people, or did it come from a disenfranchised sort of upper, lower, middle class?
Who had tasted right?
Yeah,
tasted liberty.
exactly. I think that's probably the case. Whereas I think in the American context, maybe more stronger sense of education, stronger awareness of their political situation, their history.
And I guess all of those who had gone there to establish their colonies in the 13 colonies were also, this is now me just riffing, but also were ideational in themselves, right? They'd gone there with a belief of what they wanted, and the fact that generations, the next generation after those initial settlers had gone there, they'd gone there as Quakers, they'd gone there as Shakers, as Methodists, as dissident beliefs within the church. They were informed on what they believed, and if there was something that could unite them, it was relatively fertile ground to unite those people as well, I guess. Whereas, in France, in Russia later, there wasn't something in that way to unite them.
No, indeed, the American.
I'm only posing a counterpoint, by the way, to the structural. I'm just thinking, like, obviously the processes were there because of bicameralism and this idea of maintaining that sort of ghost of Britain in the American states. So there's certainly a structural element to maybe why that was a success, but maybe there's some fertile ground ideationally as well.
They'd either left of a rejection of the current system in Europe,
or
on the belief that there is something better. So they're sort of all ripe for this brand, bright new world. Thinking anyway.
Completely.
And then with no entrenched or, you don't have the manorialism where there's deep rooted ownership of territory or of property. We all come across on the boat with very little anyway to start with, so it's sort of
the famous claim to say they let them maintain it.
So they're the great experiment. And for the period, but again, you can forget about the indigenous population within this as well, and you're talking about a very white Western view, and the political body that you're talking about is not the population.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, as we would call it today. It's still not a full all-encompassing
polity, or no, completely.
That is geographically fractional as well, with the state system that gets established with the different cultural sects that grow up. And then I find it so interesting because you can refer back to a lot of early medieval statecraft in some of that early territory grab. With that, right? Okay, take all you can and see what you can slightly get away with at the time, and then try and entrench power. But of course, then that you then have a authoritarian that is politically informed, and are frankly willing to fight for what because they see the opportunity.
Completely.
Interesting. You can see. I mean, first of all, they did have a civil war. 50 or 60 years later, so the issues were not resolved. And if you look at America today, issues are not resolved. So you could argue actually revolution sets off a direction, a change, a fundamental change for sure, but a direction, but it hasn't resolved. And you could still counterfactually say, would France have been better off? Would America have been better off if they hadn't done that? Britain would have been better off.
Completely.
America probably would have been.
And this question of faction is persistently brought up today, which is why I'm looking at it, which is that, again, we seem to be returning to a time where faction is bad, is a threat to the public will, you know, whether it be over Brexit, whether it be any political debate that we engage in now, it seems to be if there is an opposing opinion, there's no choice but to either completely convert them or demonize them as something else. And we seem to be returning to an age of that. Right.
Yeah. There's no moderation in it anymore. It's heroes and villains.
Exactly. Well, a nice way to wrap it up, I think. Thank you to everyone online, and we shall see you again in 2 weeks.